Buenos días. Muy buenos días. Good morning. Thank you, everybody, for joining us and taking the time to be here, especially for those who are in California, in Arizona. It's really early. So I hope you have some cafecito with you. Well, this panel, we have it prepared to talk about Arizona lessons reporting on racial profiling and the Latino resistance. I am Valeria Fernández. I am the new interim managing editor of Palabra, which is a publication created by the National Association of Hispanic Journalists to support independent journalists such as yourself, freelancers, affirm your work and give you a platform. I am very excited to be here because this has been part of my work for many, 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 many years. We're going to be talking about two works of journalism, a book and a film, that chronicle an important part of the history of Arizona. This is a couple of years, well, actually, it spans like almost 2 decades, with a very popular sheriff that some of you may know, Joe Arpaio. He started a crackdown in Arizona to go after unauthorized immigrants. And that, coupled with a stream of legislation at the state legislature that was aimed at criminalizing this population, actually led to a very organized, really interesting Latino resistance and voter mobilization efforts. So we will be talking about the book, Driving While Brown. And we're also going to be talking about the film Two Americans, which I created. And with me this morning, and I would love to see you and welcome you to the screen, are Terry Greene and Jude Joffe-Block. They're both from Arizona, but various parts of the country right now. So we're going to begin with a very brief introduction. Terry Greene, she is the editor-at-large of the Arizona Center for Investigative Reporting and a 3-time Arizona Journalist of the Year. She also teaches at the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at ASU, and she authored a very good previous book that's called Illegal. We also have with us Jude Joffe-Block. She joined the Associated Press in 2020. She has reported on immigration for more than a decade for outlets that include NPR and The Guardian, and she's also worked on several podcasts. So welcome to the both of you. I am so excited to have you here. Let's start first, and let's see if we see the slides right now, because I would love to see that beautiful book cover. Grace, if you can pull up the slides. There we go. There it's us. Driving While Brown and the film Two Americans. So let's start first by hearing a little bit from you from this very important period in history in Arizona, and what that meant, sort of how that later evolved into this push against anti-immigration laws and against the sheriff that in a way has so many lessons to teach to the rest of the country. We'll begin there. And then after that, I know many of you are going to be very curious. We're going to also talk about what it takes to go from beat reporting to writing a book, from beat reporting to creating a film. So I'm going to let Jude and Terry take it away and tell us a little bit of this history.
Great. And to start, can we forward the slides a couple ahead? One more. There we go.
There we go. Okay. Hi. Thank you so much for being with us. And we're so happy to talk to you today. Very briefly, our book focuses on a historical moment that begins in the 2000s. And that's when a community begins standing up to this authoritarian sheriff and the laws that enable him, as well as the voter sentiment and the mindset that enables him to target people of color in his unconstitutional policing. For many years, very few power brokers have the courage to stand up against Joe Arpaio because he's so politically popular. And what this means is that the system of checks and balances breaks down in Arizona, and Sheriff Joe Arpaio has immense power. Our book shows how the animus that brings us to this moment in history is really started centuries before, and how that builds, and also how the Latino resistance builds, the history of the Latino resistance also builds throughout history. Next slide, please.
And to set the scene, there is a long history of people of Mexican descent in Arizona feeling targeted by immigration-themed traffic stops, even before Joe Arpaio became sheriff and started immigration crackdowns that led to racial profiling of Latino motorists. And this photo is of Danny Ortega. He was born in this country, and he was a young man in the 1970s when the Peoria Police Department, which is outside of Phoenix, began targeting farm workers who were mostly from Mexico in traffic stops to check their papers. And this is a quote from Danny about how that impacted him as a young man. And if you could play the audio.
People were being stopped because they were brown, driving while brown, okay? And so we saw this not only as an attack on the undocumented community, but we saw it as an attack on us, simply because of the features of our skin and our hair color and our language.
Next slide.
Okay, so here's a really tiny snapshot profile of Joe Arpaio. He's the son of an unwanted immigrant who becomes the bane of unwanted immigrants. He's a retired federal drug enforcement agent, an official who runs for sheriff successfully in 1992. In drug enforcement, this is really important. He becomes adept at inventing personas, and he invents the persona of America's toughest sheriff. Next slide, please. Okay, so in the early 2000s, a movement builds in Arizona to restrict and punish unauthorized immigrants and unauthorized immigration from Mexico and Central America. So state legislators began to pass these laws that are intended to criminalize and deport immigrants, unauthorized immigrants. Arpaio does not initially embrace this, but when he sees that his base likes it, he pivots to immigration enforcement. Next slide, please.
And this is a press conference that Arpaio participated in 2007 because he got a partnership with the federal government to enforce immigration law, a program called 287G. And up until that point, it had really been the purview of federal immigration agents to arrest undocumented people because being undocumented in the country is not a crime, it's a civil violation. But Arpaio's partnership with the government, with the federal government, allowed his deputies to arrest immigrants and change that. So here he is. You can play the video.
My program, my philosophy is a pure program. You go after illegals. I'm not afraid to say that. And you go after them and you lock them up.
And next slide. And part of his crackdown involved raiding work sites and arresting undocumented workers and charging them with felonies. Next slide. And he also started massive neighborhood sweeps. His deputies would pull over cars for minor traffic violations like a cracked windshield or a broken taillight. And anyone who was suspected of being an undocumented immigrant would be turned over to ICE. And Latino drivers and passengers felt like they too were being targeted in these traffic stops. Next slide. And this is a scene from Valeria's film that she co-directed, Two Americans. And it shows footage from some of those neighborhood sweeps I just mentioned. And you'll also see in this clip the activists, mostly Latino activists, who rushed to try and protest and who helped the people who were being arrested at the scene of these sweeps. So go ahead and play the clip.
Solamente su nombre, no coopere, no coopere. Es solamente su nombre. Tiene el derecho a un abogado.
mean, there was no reason to pull me over at all. There was no reason. I wasn't speed. I didn't do any violation. I think it's the way I look. I look Hispanic, and I am Hispanic.
Joven, tiene el derecho a un abogado. No sea intimidado. Le van a preguntar por dónde entró, con quién entró, en dónde vive, dónde está su esposa. No conteste.
You stopped cars for having broken windshields and burnt out taillights. Explain how that is law enforcement. Explain that, Arpaio. Explain how that makes you the toughest sheriff in America.
Muchachos, ¿qué se siente? ¿Tienen algo que decir, muchachos? Ellos están aquí por eso. Todos los mexicanos que tratan de buscar trabajo no están aquí por crímenes. Esa es mentira. Esa es una mentira muy grande.
We are under attack.
Eso es lo que quiero que sepan. Y a todas las familias que se cuiden, porque esto parece un infierno. Arizona se está convirtiendo en un infierno para los hispanos.
Los van a querer intimidar. Los van a querer intimidar. Pidan por un abogado.
Next slide, please. Oh. And we really recommend you check out all of Two Americans. It's incredibly powerful.
Yeah, Two Americans is the video about that period, the movie, the film about that period in history. Okay, so who is in this resistance? Well, people who are indigenous, immigrant day laborers, Mexican Americans, older Chicanos, children of immigrants, young Latinx activists, and allies. All of them joined the resistance to Arpaio. Next slide, please. We're going to talk about individual activists in more detail if you want later on, but I wanted to introduce you to some of the people in our book right now, and also in Val's film. This is Carlos Garcia. And he grew up for a short time undocumented in Arizona, and he spends every waking hour trying to figure out how to stop Arpaio. And in the book, we tell you why. Next slide, please. And this is a main character, Lydia Guzman. And she loses her home and her husband. Her family breaks up because of the stresses of her activism. And in the book, we take you on her journey. Next slide, please. And this is the star, one of the stars of Val's film, the counterpoint to Joe Arpaio, 9-year-old Kathy Figueroa. And at the age of 9, she sees her parents who work at a car wash being led away by sheriff's deputies on the television screen. She's watching the news. And they were working at a car wash and they were undocumented and they were ensnared in one of Arpaio's raids. Kathy becomes a young, brave activist, and this photo shows her testifying before members of Congress. And again, she is a central figure in Val's film. Next slide, please.
And one tactic the movement against Arpaio uses is the courts, and they sue him in federal court for racial profiling. And activists like Lydia Guzman, who we showed you earlier, help collect evidence and find plaintiffs to help fuel that lawsuit. And in 2012, the case goes to trial in Phoenix. Next slide. And in court, Arpaio denies wrongdoing. Next slide. But this is the judge who finds that, in fact, Arpaio's immigration enforcement tactics are unconstitutional. And he orders sweeping reforms to prevent racial profiling from continuing in the sheriff's office. He permanently bars Arpaio from arresting immigrants who have not committed any crimes, which is actually something the judge had ordered even before the trial. But it comes out that the judge learns later that Arpaio ignored that court order. Next slide. And because Arpaio had violated court orders, members of this Latino-led resistance pushed for Arpaio to be punished and criminally prosecuted for criminal contempt of court. And this is Valeria Hernandez. She's a dreamer. And this is her outside of the U.S. Attorney's Office in Phoenix.
Arrest Arpaio. He has done enough crime. He has done enough suffering. He has done enough pain, and our community will not take it anymore.
Next slide.
Arrest.
So in the 2016 presidential race, Arpaio endorses Donald Trump. There is an amazingly striking similarity, so many similarities between Trump and Arpaio. And we can talk about that later if you want. But it's key to remember that the members of the resistance call Trump the national Arpaio. Next slide, please.
And many of the activists who had been battling Arpaio for years in 2016 launched a campaign called Basta Arpaio to get him out of office. And they spell it with AZ for Arizona. And they mobilized voters of color who did not have a history of voting. Next slide.
So thanks to the work of the resistance, after 24 years, Arpaio is booted out of office. He's voted out of office. He loses his re-election bid. Next slide, please. And after a criminal trial, Arpaio is found guilty of criminal contempt of court. But before he's sentenced, his friend Donald Trump gives him a break with his first presidential pardon. Next slide, please.
And this is our last slide, that Arpaio later tries running for office again, but he's not successful. But the grassroots effort to mobilize voters of color in Arizona keeps going. And this is Maria Castro. She's an activist who had walked neighborhoods trying to get out the vote since she was in high school in 2011. And she's still at it in 2020. And that year in November, she told us that she'd never seen voters as excited to participate as they were in 2020. And that excitement is one reason that Arizona turns blue in the 2020 presidential election. And Maria told us, I think the defeat of Joe Arpaio made it tangible that we can defeat the villains that haunt our dreams. So that's the end of our presentation.
Thank you very much, Terry and Jude. That's like extremely complete, so much history to pack. And, you know, the court case was so complex. There was also that Department of Justice investigation for abuse of power. I mean, no, that was the racial profiling, civil rights investigation. There was another investigation allegedly on abuse of power. So much, such a complicated period of history in Arizona. And we're here to talk about lessons learned. And, you know, I think that you were probably uniquely positioned when Trump got elected to have a different perspective when covering immigration issues because of the experiences that we have in Arizona. So how did these lessons in covering racial profiling and our own form of family separation impacted the way that you went on to approach your reporting? You were already working on the book. So how did that impacted your reporting?
Well, what's interesting about Arizona is that in a way, Arizona was about a decade ahead of the rest of the country. So the kind of political fervor and excitement and popularity that we saw around Trump's campaign about cracking down on immigration, Arizona had already lived through that. And the backlash that we also saw against the way that Trump was handling immigration, that had also already played out, that these sort of dueling movements had already emerged and were clashing in Arizona for some time. And I think by covering events in Arizona, we were able to see that part of the real story was people on the ground organizing and having agency and trying to affect change. And what an important place to kind of put our focus as reporters that was. And I think one of the motivations for trying to tell the complete history of what happened with Arpaio and what happened in court with him is that too often it gets reduced to this lawsuit and it's a soundbite and you hear from a lawyer, and the ACLU and MALDEF were involved in suing Arpaio. And often, you know, as reporters, that's where we go for our quotes because it's after court and you grab a quote from the lawyer. But there's also this whole community element of the people who are impacted on the ground, not only people who are victimized, but people who are also part of the effort to counter what is happening and affect change. And so I think as reporters, we have to really think about this global view when we're looking at these conflicts of, you know, it can be very tempting to look at sort of what's exactly happening in court or at the ballot box or with a candidate, but there's this whole grassroots element that might be organizing, and in some places it might not be well established and you might have to really look for it to see it. But yeah, I think that's what Arizona showed us, just how much activity was happening on the ground with people who identify as activists and also people who are just regular people who joined.
Terry, you've been here in Arizona for a long, long time. So, I mean, yeah, how did this sort of shifted? Or maybe you were already going in that direction, but yeah.
Yeah, I was doing a lot of national reporting on because I'm an independent journalist. So I was writing for national outlets. But I mean, I just want to echo everything Jude said. She's right on target, and you know, emphasize the importance of our role as journalists to contextualize moments in history and events that we're covering, to contextualize and explain from all angles what those moments mean and why those moments matter.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that I started to learn in the years of being a reporter is that, you know, the public has a very short-term memory. Right. And as journalists, we're here to be that pain in the back memory that says, last year you said so-and-so, 5
Right.
years, say that, and hold politicians accountable. And I wanted to also tell our audience that we're going to be opening up these panels to questions, that you can ask questions at any time. I mean, I'll keep asking and talking to Jude and Terry. I could talk to them forever. But this panel is open for you to ask any kind of questions you have, including questions that have to do with the process of writing the book, anything you want to know. One thing, Terry and Jude, that I've heard throughout that time, especially, you know, 2006, 2007, when Arpaio started really boosting this crackdown and going into the neighborhoods, and people were truly terrorized, right? You see that mother with a baby, so upset, and then this other woman saying that Arizona became a kind of hell for Hispanics. At one point, he was compared with Bull Connor, this commissioner in Alabama. And at that time, you know, back in the day, later on by historians, he was called the perfect adversary for the civil rights movement in a certain way. I apologize, I'm very congested, but you can still hear me. And so he was called this perfect adversary because he allowed the movement to sort of focus on around something and then push back. Do you think that Arpaio was, in a way, sort of this perfect adversary for the Latino resistance?
I think it's a really good point, because I think what's really one of the subtle nuances of the story of what was going on with Arpaio and this nexus of local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement, you know, it's very controversial what role local police should have in deporting immigrants who are not criminals, or sort of enabling, helping ICE locate immigrants and for deportation. And that, you know, that is something that is being debated and continues to be debated. And we've seen a lot of change just in the last few years about the role that local law enforcement is playing in this. But what's interesting is that in some jurisdictions, this kind of sheriffs and other law enforcement are playing a big role in identifying immigrants and turning them over to ICE, but they're doing it much more quietly, without press releases, without big publicity stunts, without all the fanfare that Arpaio did. By making it such a political issue, he also allowed people to really see what was going on and allowed something to protest against. He created big theatrical sweeps that people could come to, protesters and counter-protesters, and it became this very visible debate. But I think in a lot of jurisdictions in our country, people would be surprised to note exactly how much immigration enforcement is happening at the local level, and it's just happening so much more quietly that it becomes less of a focal point. And so that was also an issue in the case, where in the legal case against Arpaio, the people suing him for racial profiling were able to use his press releases, his statements to the media, things that Arpaio had said could be used against him because he was just so vocal about what he was doing.
Jude, there's some questions. Val, there's some questions we have.
Oh, we stopped being able to hear you.
I'm so sorry. I was saying I have to step away for 1 second. It's summer, but somehow I caught some sort of like a flu cold thing. Yeah, we have some great questions here. I'm going to present some of them in different order, so it's not like I'm prioritizing, Somebody's asking, how do you practice self-care when you report on such complex and taxing subjects?
I mean, I think that for me, the people that we were interviewing in this case had endured so much trauma, and it was very difficult to interview some people because we were talking to some people, maybe 10 years after some events that they had lived through that they would prefer not to go back and remember. And I think that goes for a lot of us when we're interviewing people about difficult subjects. And I think so I think even more importantly, is also to think about, when we interview people, what that means, setting a space for them that feels safe and that go slowly, tell people in advance what you want to talk about, ask permission to go there, be very straightforward about where you want to go in an interview, and make sure it's a setting where that person would be comfortable having an emotional release. Likely somewhere in their home, but maybe they don't want to be with other family members nearby. And so thinking through all of these dynamics for these interviews that can be really difficult. And so I think, sometimes my brain goes there first. And then in terms of self-care, I don't think I have a lot of answers. I think it's an excellent question. I think a lot of us journalists do sometimes not even realize how much we're taking on of other people's grief and knowing exactly what to do with it. Sometimes it feels like sharing their stories is what we want to do. And then you want to do the best you can to really represent what they felt in that moment. And that can be a lot of pressure that we put on ourselves as well. And I think that does lead to our own feelings of despair at the end. And, and I'm certainly all ears for Strat. I don't pretend to have the answers on that one.
Terry, I saw that you lifted your hand.
Yeah, self-care. I honestly do not practice self-care when I am on a story because, stories happen. Schedules are unpredictable when we're on a story or on a book. We just, we have to cover what we have to cover. And if it's 1 o'clock in the morning, it's 1 o'clock in the morning. We just do it. But I think in the continuum, when I do have a break, I walk my dog. I love to take long walks. I talk to my family. I'm nourished by my family and their support. So those are two things. But for me, the greatest therapy for covering injustice is not my own self-care, but writing true, writing true stories is my therapy. I don't know if I could live seeing an injustice and not writing about it. That's my therapy. That's my self-care for my soul.
I am going to add, I don't want to take away too much here, but here's my self-care. The two of you have been instrumental at different moments in my life and in my career. Just a phone call away, just a WhatsApp text message away. Other journalists are your biggest cheerleaders and supporters, and they understand you like no one else. Sometimes, family can't quite. So definitely turn to them. Even if you don't know them that much, I'm sure there'll be someone there wanting to be your mentor and really encourage you and support you through those difficult times. And it's a really important question. We have another great question. Solutions journalism provides spaces for folks to find new ways to get organized and also ways to cover Latinx stories. Can you share with us experiences you encountered throughout your research?
Let me see.
I take the question to be that which instances do you see in your reporting? Maybe you were not able to address it in the book completely, in which the way that you reported the story turned more towards the solutions journalism aspect. That's how I understand the question, right?
So a story always has a tension, which is the unanswered question, right? That every story has a question that we want to have answered. And the solution journalism comes in on the answer. And in the book, what we found with the Latino resistance, the Latino-led resistance that we covered was this remarkable organization that offered the solution, which was getting rid of Arpaio and voting him out of office and continuing on fighting civil rights abuses. So the resistance was made up of many prongs, and their solution, which we reported, was taking the resistance to the streets so that it kept the attention of the public, so the public could not turn their eyes away from injustice. Taking the resistance to the courts so that there could be remedies and justice in the courts. Taking the resistance to the public square so that and this fits in with taking it to the streets, so that there is agency and there are voices that are heard loud and clear, and taking the resistance to the voting booth by signing up voters. So those were some of the solutions that we found writing the book that we learned through our reporting. I hope that answers the question a little bit.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. I think that's like a huge point. And there are so many examples of solutions journalism in the history of Arizona to be told about. I mean, I remember in our film, the Repeal Coalition, this local organization that came from Flagstaff, which is like 2 hours from Phoenix, and started organizing people in neighborhoods, and they'll get together inside their garages, and they will just like pass information to each other. And when someone was in court because they were arrested in one of Arpaio's sweeps, maybe for working with false documents or an identity, these people will go with them to the court because it could be so scary to go as an undocumented immigrant family member to a courtroom. You don't know if they're going to arrest you. And I think it makes sense to be afraid, especially at that time. Okay. So, that was like a really interesting model of community organizing, which was empowering people like Kathy, the young girl, like her family. They all became involved through that process, and later involved with Carlos Garcia, which is an activist now that's part of the City Council of Phoenix that's featured in your book. We have another question. Your report in the book highlights a powerful Latinx movement in Arizona. Have you seen other similar Latinx movements emerging elsewhere in the country since then?
It's a fantastic question. And I feel like we've been so laser focused on Arizona for the last few years that I can't say that I'm an expert. But I think that's, as reporters, especially people who are at this conference, it's part of our mandate, I think, to look for these movements that are emerging, and try to understand where they're coming from and what their goals are and what they're doing. And I think that we're seeing, the Latino population growing. We're seeing places like Georgia emerge with new Latino voting power and having a say in elections. And so I think that really in all of our communities, there will be some signs that the Arizona experience is going to be unique because it was shaped by very specific Arizona history, the fact that Arizona used to be part of Mexico, a long history of different laws and dynamics. But I think some of the dynamics do carry over and could be repeated in other places.
Terry, do you want to add something to?
No, Jude is right on. I would say also add that members of the Latinx resistance in Arizona, when Trump took office, they were asked by groups all over the United States to come and speak to them about effective resistance. And the Latino-led resistance in Arizona now is still going on because, one of the lessons that we all know is that resistance never ends. So it just builds on itself. We just keep standing on the shoulders of the giants who came before us. So I think that what was going on in Arizona was so egregious that this powerful resistance rose up. And I have no doubt if what happened in Arizona was happening in another state or is happening in another state, that a powerful resistance would rise up because it's untenable.
Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah.
One group that comes to mind that is worthwhile highlighting is called Mi Gente, because it's an organization that was born out of Arizona and became national, and is doing a lot of intersectionality work, also connecting with the African American community. And so they are an example of they were actually some of those people that went to other parts of the country and trained others. And of course, we have people coming from California, like Lydia Guzman, who's featured in your book, who brought those experiences with fighting against Prop 187, which was legislation actually was approved by the voters and had a huge impact on the community. So you have that there too, right? We were behind in a way in organizing. California was ahead.
Absolutely. And I think it's also always worth mentioning that one of the movements that is very central to Arizona and elsewhere is, of course, the Dreamer movement. And the activism of Dreamers in Arizona was very much intertwined with the broader fights. And some of the people who came up as young people who have continued on in politics came up through Dreamer-related activism in Arizona and have gone on to do things in other places as well. And that's obviously something happening nationwide.
Yeah, a super great point. Yeah.
I just wanted to add one thing about self-care that just popped into my head. If you haven't listened to Val's podcast, listen to it because it's all about air. And if I had heard that podcast when I was writing the book with Jude, maybe I would have engaged in more self-care.
It's called Comadres al Aire, and we recommend it.
Yes.
Thank you for the promotion. Yeah, Comadres al Aire. You can find it in YouTube and comadresalaire.com. All right. We have another question, which is really good and gets us into some interesting stuff here. How did you guys go about making sure all parties had a chance to explain their point of view? Were you able to get any sheriff deputies to give you an interview?
No, it's a great point. And the book does take many perspectives into account. And we wanted to cast a really wide net to understand the perspectives of Arizonans who were seeing immigration fights and policing issues differently in Arizona. So we spent a lot of time with Sheriff Arpaio for this book. We interviewed him almost 30 times over the span of more than a decade to get his perspective of where he was coming from, as well as his chief deputy and a handful of other people in the sheriff's department, some of who did not all have this shared perspective, and as well as some of Arpaio supporters. And so we felt like it was really important to show all of the sides and where people were coming from to better understand how this conflict emerged. We felt like that was the best way to have a document that would really be a public service, that if we could show the human perspectives on all sides and really people who weren't necessarily talking to each other, at least represent them all in one volume.
Right, and I just wanted to add, the other thing is we talked to the sheriff a lot, as Jude said, and Jude talked to some deputies, but we also had the court testimony. We listened to the deputies testify, and we could weave that testimony into the book narrative so that it was writerly and interesting, and not just Deputy X testified X, but we could actually weave it in real time when the events were happening. And also police reports and other public records. There was one deputy who had kind of a nervous breakdown and later ended his life. And we had a lot of police reports from that. And so we worked really hard to get those voices in and make it writerly. The other thing that we talked to a lot of activists who supported Arpaio, and they were very generous with their time and perspectives.
And we also had court exhibits as well,
right,
which really helped. So, we had all of the exhibits that were used in the court case, and that from both sides.
Right.
So different emails and records and things like that. And so we were able to use that to weave a deeper narrative as well.
And you had people also that were at the high command level too, that left the agency and that were able to give you some really great insights and interviews, right? I'm thinking about someone in particular.
Yeah, it's always important to look for people who have left. That's a great way to get some answers that you might not find from people who are still there. So I would often request from the sheriff's office like a roster of who had retired, and then ask those people for interviews. And so that's something that I'll continue to do in my reporting.
A great tip, a really great tip, Jude. Well, we have about 15 minutes left, and I want to continue to invite our amazing audience that's asking great questions to ask more questions. Let's talk a little bit about the process of, Jude, you were working for the local NPR radio station, covering a lot of things about immigration here in Arizona. You started focusing on the trial. Terry, you were doing national magazine stories for different outlets, long form. You were also following this history, with what was happening in immigration, this sort of like war on immigrants in a way. How do you go from that to like making a book, which is massive in a way, because this book really is chronicling history in a big way, and it has all these, I have it right here. It has all these footnotes at the end. All these like notations from all the multiple sources that you have. This is truly like a document of history. How do you go from that?
Ganas. I think Ganas is the number one thing. we really wanted to, we both saw this as a book, and frankly, very few other people did. And we were bonded together in 2012 when we were covering the trial. And both of us saw this moment as history, as epical, as something that needed to be recorded and needed to be written about in a long form, just like when you made your film, and I got to watch you make your film. I want to share an anecdote about you making the film. Kathy Figueroa was having a birthday party, the little girl that, the little 9-year-old that became an activist, and you had the camera, and at that point it was really early on, and you were trying to figure out how to work the camera and document the birthday party, and you did it, and it was brilliant. And I think that is sort of a metaphor for writing a book. You just decide that you're going to do it, and you work really, really hard to find someone who wants to publish it. And sometimes that takes years, and you have a great partner that, like with Jude and I, we had complementary skills. We had, my skills fit her needs, and her skills fit my needs. And we were very, very organized. And I think that's very important when you're taking all this reporting from years and years and records and everything, and just organizing it and writing an outline and saying, this is a story that matters and we believe in it. By George, we're just going to do it. It took us a long time. It took us, Jude, how many years would you say it took us? Because
when we first started really kind of working on, because with a book, first there's a book proposal, and first you want to get an agent interested, and so then you have to have something to show an agent who wants to take you on, and then you work with the agent on a book proposal that the agent sells, and then often there's a lot of rejection,
yes.
and then hopefully somebody says yes at some point. And then there's drafts, and then, editing and more editing. And then in our case, your story changes. And so we first started that process of securing an agent in 2015. And our book came out in April of 2021. So that gives you a sense of just how long it happened. In our case, a lot of the story hadn't happened yet in 2015. So the Trump was not even a figure yet. Arpaio was still in office. A lot of the events that we cover in the book hadn't happened. So in our case, it was actually very useful because we ended up being able to do a mix of history and documenting things in real time. And when we could document things in real time as they were unfolding, it was actually a lot easier to do that reporting, of course. But uncovering the history was in many ways more rewarding because it was stuff that other people didn't know or had been forgotten, or little tidbits that had been lost. And so that part of really going back to sort of, what are the origin stories? How did so-and-so become an activist? What was the history of racial profiling in Arizona? These questions that we hadn't really seen explored, that was really rewarding to tackle. But yeah, like Terry said, it involved a really, we had files for each year and each month so that we could keep things. We had a timeline that had thousands of entries so that we could know what order things happened in. And so, yeah, it can be a really big undertaking to organize. But I think a lot of people can identify with that feeling where when you're a beat reporter, I was in public radio, I would have 4 minutes to cover something, and it was always missing the bigger context of how did we get here and kind of what happened in the 2 decades before this new piece of news happened. And I think sometimes you'll catch a wave where you'll be in the midst of something and say, hey, I'm right here and I'm watching all this happen, and I think I can put all the ingredients together to tell the bigger story. And so I think when that wave comes, really sort of take stock and think about whether there's something bigger you might be able to do.
Right. What are the unanswered questions? We kept, asking each other, again, we outlined the book really early so that you need to have sort of a framework so that you can start writing your chapters. But like Val's film, Two Americans, is so immediate, and you have this incredible tension you can feel in the film because she was there in real time. So we had to figure out, how to write with tension when we were covering so many, really 100 years of history, and so many court cases and stuff. How to take that wonderful tension that Val had in her film and like keep it moving throughout a book, which was a challenge, but I think we did it.
And Val, I'd love to hear from you about how you made your transition.
Oh no, it was a moving target. I experienced in a way the same thing that you did, because we started in 2008, and obviously I was reporting on these sweeps and raids. I was covering this since the very beginning, so I was like sort of witnessing the history, and I have all my notes and all of that. And then we're like, this has to become a film. This people need to see what's happening in Arizona. So there was a sense of urgency, but we didn't get it really fully finished until 2013, like the last version. So, from 2008 to 2013, things kept changing. 2010, we had this moment with SB 1070, which was this bill that basically criminalized people's presence in the state, and also is called the Papers, Please law, because it made allow the police to just ask for documents if they suspected someone was here without papers. So those things kept throwing us, curbs, because they were new investigations. And so there's just too much dirt, to be honest, that's coming out of this agency. And, so we focus on the people, we focus on the families and how their life changed. And we focus on the sheriff as a person too. And we sort of like foreshadow what we imagined was, in a way, his downfall. Even though it didn't happen in our film, we kind of left him in this place of, singing with Elvis in a bar, this song from Frank Sinatra. But anyways, and then we've seen now that he lost the election in 2016, and that was like huge. And that's sort of what we thought it was the direction. Well, I would love to hear from you, just tiny, if you can encapsulate it in 1 minute. What has been sort of a personal, how is your personal connection to this? Jude, I know you talked about that last time with your family. Terry, I know you also have family in Mexico. Can you share just very quickly, because we have 5 minutes?
Yeah, so my background, I mean, I became an immigration reporter and fascinated with immigration because my grandparents had to flee Europe. They were Jews, and they just made it into the United States and escaped the Nazis. And so I grew up always being told that had that immigration story not worked out, that I probably wouldn't exist. And so that understanding of who can be here and who's allowed to be an American and how are they treated, and that's always been one of my central interests. And I think this story in Arizona just highlights so many of those questions of who really gets to be here and what rights do they have.
So very briefly, I grew up in a borderlands family, Arizona and Sonora. And so I feel that that sort of DNA mix gave me an opportunity to be able to talk to both sides my whole life. So that's one thing that drove me. And the second thing that drove me is that injustice of any kind to anyone really pisses me off, and I want to write about it.
Oh, that's beautiful. And you don't know it, but they both speak really great Spanish. And I think you really understand this topic very well. You have spent a lot of time on it, and I'm very proud of the work that you've done. We're going to put your emails in our chat So if you want to get in touch with Terry and with Jude, ask them more questions. If you have a book in mind, if you want to interview them, because there certainly could be really good voices in your stories, they're available. Do you have a website for the book, or do you have individual websites?
Individual websites.
Okay, so we'll try to share those also. Driving While Brown. Look, this is me trying to pretend I'm like a TV host. Here is the book. And if you also want to see my film that I co-directed with Dan DeVivo, you can go to 2americans.com and you can watch it there. There's a few, it has subtitles also for English, Spanish, vice versa. So everyone can watch it. And it's twoamericans.com. We have 3 more minutes because we've been so good. So in these 3 minutes, tell me, what do you wish you'd been able, one thing to include in the book in the 2 minutes?
Oh, something that didn't make it in.
Uh-oh.
Yeah, I mean, I think so. What I found to be the hardest part about this is that really this is a huge community story, like a community biography almost of what was happening in Maricopa County for 2 decades and all of the people it impacted. But as journalists, we can't tell everybody's story, and making those decisions about whose stories to highlight can be really painful, I think. I mean, for me, I think because we know so many people when we're out reporting, and we can't include them on. And there were countless people who were impacted by what happened and then were involved in the fights on either side and played critical roles. And sometimes when I'm paging through the book, I'll think, oh, that would have been really good paragraph right there. And but we have word counts, and even in books, which you think are really long, but actually, once you open the door to a big topic, it's kind of hard to stuff everything in. So that, for me, that's it.
So for me, I had already written a book looking at this moment in history from the immigrants' perspective, telling the stories through the people who were most impacted, and that's when I got to know Val. But with this book, there's nothing, we didn't have any more room. So I'm used to word counts. So I think we did the very best we could. And, we're so grateful to be with you all. And we hope you buy the book, and we hope you buy it new, because that helps us. And we hope you watch Val's film, and we hope you listen to Val's podcast, because it is amazing. And we'd all be healthier if we listened to it.
Thank you so much, Terry, Greene, Sterling, Jude, Joffe-Block, great colleagues, great friends. I want to invite all of you to a panel we have tomorrow with Palabra, which is at noon Pacific time. And we're going to be talking about freelancing opportunities, grants, fellowships with IWMF, Solutions Journalism, the Pulitzer Center. That's a really great panel. So also you too, you may want to join. Yes. Thank you very much once again, Terry and Jude, and to all of you that took the time to join us and for your great questions. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.